Director at the California Preservation Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to CPF's program, The Doctor is In. This is a series of programs on a variety of topics, important topics that are meant to give you an opportunity to ask questions on these topics. Today, we are covering the California's historic tax credit. And why isn't my screen advancing?
Oh, we also, you'll need to share your screen as well, Cindy.
Well, that would be nice. Let me get in there. How's that?
Great. Yep.
Okay. All right. So today, as I mentioned, we're covering California's historic tax credit. And joining in the conversation today are Albert Rex with McCrossy Historic Advisors, LLC, and Tony Gonzalez, Principal with London and Gonzalez Advocacy. So we're going to start with a brief background on the genesis of the historic tax credit in California. The main takeaway here is that this did not happen overnight. It took 19 years to get to this point. The first bill was introduced in 2000, and it was ultimately adopted in 2019. The bill, or the effort, really picked up momentum when then Speaker of the Assembly, Toni Atkins, threw her support behind the bill. The bill in 2014 made it to the governor's desk with unanimous support, but was ultimately vetoed literally in the 11th hour. We tried it again in 2015, but the bill died in committee. In 2019, the bill was reintroduced by now Senate Pro Tem Toni Atkins and was signed by Governor Newsom in October of 2019. We are fortunate to have the support of Senator Atkins, who is a real champion for historic preservation in California. We're also fortunate to have the support of Tony Gonzalez, who advised us every step of the way. So there was a broad range of support for this bill, from labor unions to YIMBY and every major preservation organization in California. And throughout all of our work to pass this bill, we underscored the economic benefits of historic preservation throughout the whole campaign. We also had a very important and valued partner in the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who provided information about the economic benefits and other state tax credits. It was extremely important for us to be able to reach out to our partners in other states that have the tax credits to find out what their experience was like and to find out how the tax credit was working for them. It was also important for us to know the leveraging impact or effect of the tax credits to see how the tax credits adopted at the state level also affected the applications for tax credits at the federal level. So I'm going to go over just some of the features of SB 451, California's historic tax credit. Under this bill, the tax credit is equal to 20% of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures with respect to certified historic structures. The tax credit can be increased by 5% to 25% if the structure meets one of 5 criteria. It's either located on federal, state, or local surplus property. The rehabilitated structure includes affordable housing for lower income households. The structure is part of a military base reuse authority. The structure is a transit-oriented development that is a higher density mixed use development within walking distance of half mile to a transit station. Or the structure is located in a designated census tract. California's tax credit also applies to residential owner-occupied structures. There is a $2 million set aside for tax credits for specific projects that are owner-occupied. And there are some conditions that must be met in order for a homeowner to receive those tax credits. So how is the tax credit applied? Buildings must be a, quote, certified historic structure. And that is that they must be listed on the California Register of Historic Places. Within the $50 million allocation for the California's tax credits, there is a $10 million total set aside. $8 million of that 10 is set aside for small commercial projects that are less than $1 million. And $2 million is set aside for residential projects. All of the tax credit applications or tax credits are allocated on a first come, first served basis. There is no prioritization. And any carryover of unallocated credits is carried over into the following year. Some of the limitations on the residential tax credit are the combined annual household income cannot exceed $200,000. The work that is done is limited to that work that will rehabilitate the historic character and improve the integrity of the residence. So you can't come in and apply for a bathroom remodel or a kitchen remodel. The legislation was pretty specific in that this has to be, that there must be some limitations on the type of work that would qualify for residential tax credits. It is subject to the 20 or 25% tax credit, but it can't be less than $5,000 nor more than $20,000, and it can only be allocated once every 10 years. When an individual or a firm receives the tax credit, it can be carried forward for 8 years or until the tax credit is expended. There is an effective date of the tax credit that's built into the bill of January 1st, 2021, and that sunsets on January 1st, 2026. And the state tax credit must be allocated annually. That is, a $50 million credit must be allocated annually within the state budget. It's not automatic. Some of the other major provisions of the bill include the application process. The application and the rules regarding the application are being developed by the California Office of Historic Preservation and the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. Some of the features that must be included in that application include how frequently is the tax credit used. The applicant must indicate the number of jobs that are created during and after the rehabilitation. What are the projected increases in state and local taxes, including wages and property taxes? And the applicant must also list if there are any other additional incentives that are being included, such as a receipt of the federal tax credit. This must be included in the application. So these are just some of the high points of the bill. The bill can be accessed online, and I'll send you all that information on where you can get it. You can get it at the website, find Ledge Info online. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Albert Rex, and he can talk about the federal nexus with the state tax credits.
Great, thanks, Cindy. If you want to go to the next slide. Happy to be here today and to discuss the California credit with CPF. Congratulations, after 19 years of getting it passed. Clearly, As we know, these tax credits take a long time to get passed. They take constant vigilance to keep passed once they're there. And I think that was what Tony will talk about next. As Cindy said, I'm Albert Rex. I'm with McCroskey Historic Advisors. We have a national historic tax credit consulting practice based in DC with offices around the country, including an office in San Jose. I'm not actually in DC. I work out of our Boston office, so I am closer to Boston at the very moment, sequestered in my home. Joining me today on the call are a couple of my colleagues, Bill McCroskey, our founding principal, Jennifer Hembry, who runs our San Jose office, Julianne Murphy is also there in San Jose, and then Catherine Ferguson, who's our Director of Marketing and Business Development. We're going to talk a little bit about, what is the impact of a credit relative to bringing other kinds of dollars in, particularly the federal historic tax credit, and what you see happens when a state adopts the credit, why that's important, and how advocacy on the federal and the state side can work together to promote both programs, and how important it is to do that. And as I said, Tony is going to touch on that aspect of it. I'm just going to kind of give a global overview of what we've seen happen in other states when state tax credits have been passed, and what the general impact is, and how you can maybe apply some of these thoughts to California as you move forward with continued advocacy on the front of your program. Prior to joining McCroskey Historic Advisors, I was an advocate. I was the executive director of a citywide program in Boston and involved in creating the Massachusetts state tax credit. So I was I had hair, so that was like 2004, I believe. When we got the credit passed, it was about a 5-year slug to get it through. And it taught me a lot about the credit programs that are out there and what makes an effective credit program, and how, since its passing in 2004, I've worked closely with Preservation Massachusetts, our statewide, to continue every year to think about how can we advocate to keep the credit, and how can we keep it better. Things like sunsets, annual appropriations, potential increases, changes to the law. So as I said, the advocacy does not stop once the credit gets passed. It actually even ramps up more. So what you see on your screen here is from an article that Catherine Ferguson, our marketing director, actually did for Novogradac magazine in April, and it was really looking at the new California credit. And as I said, we look at these state credits a lot. We do a bi-monthly column in Novogradac magazine, and it's the theme is state tax credits. So we have a lot of information about the credit programs and look at them, how they work closely around the US. We've worked with the National Trust folks as well, gathering data and kind of sharing that information. And we think state tax credits are a really powerful tool for multiple reasons. One, obviously, clearly, is to get the federal credit incentivized to be used in the state. We'll talk about that in a second. Another one is that a big percentage of our work is affordable housing work, and the historic credits, both state and federal, play such an important role in contributing to the sources for historic tax credit projects, especially in high value states like California or East Coast states, Massachusetts. High construction costs, high land values. You need every subsidy you can get in order to make these projects work. And we have found that the historic credits are a great combination for those projects. And it's nice. It's kind of motherhood and apple pie. You're creating good affordable housing and preserving historic buildings, as we know, which has a catalytic effect. So we love working on those kinds of projects. So on the screen here, you'll see on the left-hand side is the use of the federal credit in Texas, beginning in 2015 and carrying through to 2019. And on the right-hand side, you have the same table showing the use of the federal credit in California. So the reason we're doing these comparatives between California and Texas are that they're both states with very large economies compared to many other states, and their economies aren't exact in size, but similar in size. So if you look at what Texas looked like in 2015, prior to the introduction of their state tax credit program, as you can see, they had 22 Part 2 applications and 3 Part 2 approvals. Same year, the state of California had 7 and 9. So, comparatively, the Texas market was already bigger. More resources were using historic credits. 2016, the state historic credit gets introduced. I will say the state credit in Texas is a very lucrative program from a use perspective. It is an uncapped program with a 25% credit. It's freely transferable, which is different than the California credit. So you can create create a market for the transfer of these credits. And at 25%, it has more impact on the project than the federal credit does. But you'll see in the first year after the introduction of the credit in 2016, you got an increase of 10 more projects. But by 2018, between 2017 and 2018, you saw the number of applications double. And as you can see, the number of dollars being invested from a historic perspective went up significantly. So, the expectation, I would think, in California is to see the same thing, is that the introduction of the credit, even at a capped credit, will spur interest in the federal credit and certainly make the federal credit a more usable tool in the state. It's not just to think about the state credit, the federal credit from the perspective of, well, how do you really jump from 22 projects in Texas to 44 projects? Why such an increase in the use of federal credit? Well, it's that simple. It's not just an increase in use of federal credit. It's really an increase of historic preservation projects. That the credit amount is enough to make some projects that were marginal before happen, or make some projects that are marginal from a state tax credit or a federal tax credit perspective, maybe slightly smaller dollar projects happen. So the exponential effect of the credit is not just because you have a state credit in place, but it is actually the finances of the projects can work much more efficiently, and therefore there's federal credit use increases. So there's an anticipation that you'll get that level of increase. You can see the quote at the bottom of the screen there from Donovan Ripkema. So anybody that's been in historic preservation for a long time has heard of Don. He has been the economic voice for historic preservation for at least 30 plus years now. I used to say if Don Ripkema was wrong, we have a real problem, because he was really the only person focusing on our industry. Fortunately, he has not been wrong so far. But we were able to have a conversation, Catherine Ferguson and I, last week with Don, to talk about state credit programs. And he pointed out that there is this 40 to 60% increase in use. So you can imagine what the impact should be in California. Additionally, the other thing to note that he found during his work is that 40 to 50% of the dollars allocated to a project in state tax credits are actually obviously used before the tax credit ever happens, because as we know, there's economic development happening around these things. So as we start thinking about where is the economy currently, this is different than 2008. This is not a liquidity issue with banks. This is an issue with the economy in general from the COVID impact. And you start thinking about what's going to happen next to the economy. How can tax credits play a role in stimulating the economy and getting folks back to work? So if we want to go on to the next slide, we can look at a little bit about what's happening at the federal level with a couple different things. And so this is, if any of you follow the federal program closely, about 10 years ago, a group was formed, the Historic Tax Credit Coalition, HTCC, because we're an industry of short names or initials. HTCC was formed really to support the tax credit program. Again, for us that have been here a long time, National Trust, Preservation Action, these organizations were very focused on a broader subject of historic preservation, and there weren't a lot of folks advocating directly for the tax credit program. And so the HTC coming together to form was really about getting industry professionals involved. The LIHTC community, the low-income housing tax credit community, had a huge lobbying effort and was well represented in Washington, but we were not. So the Historic Tax Credit Coalition formed to really think about potential changes to the credit. The credit really hadn't changed since 1986 when Reagan changed the tax laws. But with our new president in place, there's a lot of concern during that period of time from the Historic Tax Credit Coalition that the federal credit could be impacted by some kind of tax bill. And as we all know, it was the tax bill of 2017, which almost got rid of the federal credit altogether, but was saved through the support of a few folks. Senator Cassidy out of Louisiana was very important in moving a bill forward, as was Representative Blumenauer. So our friends on the Hill really saved the credit. As we know, it went from being a 5-year credit taken in 1 year to a 5-year credit spread over 5 years, which had an impact on the value of the credit, which is another reason state historic credits are so important. The changing in pricing for the federal credit has made it harder to use the federal credit. So states with state credits are continuing to see bigger investments because there's more money available to developers to make this thing happen. So prior to COVID, there had already been talk by the coalition of getting our friends in the legislature to forward a bill called the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, HTC-GO. And there's a couple things in that bill that are worth note. One was a 30% credit for projects with less than $2.5 million in QREs, to create transferable credit for those smaller projects. Side note, that was probably dead on arrival, but it was in there. So that was, another thing to be in there. It was to look at the basis test and reduce it, not requeue it, but reduce it from 100 to 50%. So as folks that use the credit know now that, if you have a building and you purchase it for $1 million, you have to spend $1 million in order to utilize the federal historic tax credits. In some high value areas, I'm sure some areas in California, certainly in Manhattan, it's really hard to use the federal credit because of that basis test issue. So the idea is to reduce that basis test to 50% to create a much larger volume of projects that can potentially use the credit. Eliminate the basis adjustment, which is another important thing. The basis adjustment happens when you combine the federal historic tax credit with low-income housing tax credit. You have to reduce your basis in the low-income housing tax credit by the amount of historic credit you get. So let's say you had a $10 million project and you had a $2 million historic credit. Your basis is now $8 million instead of $10 million. So that basis adjustment would certainly have a positive impact. And amend the qualified lease rules. That's really about how long a term of a lease and a nonprofit can have. Next slide, please. So when COVID hit, our friends on the Hill came to the Historic Tax Credit Coalition and said, give us your best ideas for how to stimulate the economy. So one was, let's look at the GO Zone Act we already have out there, or HTC-GO, excuse me, and put that out there, and let's try to get that passed. The second one was to look at increasing the federal credit. Now, this is not a unusual idea. A slightly different situation, but the GO Zone, the Golf Opportunity Zone, came about after Katrina, and the federal credit was increased from a 20% credit to a 26% credit. And it certainly had a significant impact on development in those areas that were covered in the GO Zone, including Louisiana, Alabama, parts of Mississippi. So the feds have been willing to, in the past, increase the credit in order to stimulate the economy. So the idea that was put forward from the Historic Tax Credit Coalition is to increase the federal credit from a 20% credit to a 30% credit for 4 years, and then have it step down to 26% and then down to 23%. So this is, again, a way, the thought is that something is going to come out of COVID. There is going to be another relief package of some kind. Is this something that we could support stimulating the economy? And as most people on the phone know, and Cindy can speak to when you look at the research, just the impact of the credit, it is really a great economic development tool. And it certainly puts all these dollars being spent in your state prior to, prior to the projects being placed in service and prior to that tax impact hitting the state. A couple things to think about, and then I'll pass this over to Tony, is that if you think about the federal credit and advocating for it, California is an important state. I believe you have 4 members that are on Ways and Means, which is a pretty big deal. You have a few powerful senators, a couple powerful Congress people. So there's a way to, I think, lobby for the federal credit that could be also supportive of the idea of how the federal credit can help with economic development in the state of California. If you think about the California credit getting passed and a 30% federal credit, that's really important. Some people will say, well, if the federal credit gets increased to 30%, why do you need the state credit? Believe me, we will need the state credit in the economy that we're coming into. You think about all the retail rentals, people will have to, are doing buildings with ground floor retail and residential units above those retail spaces with changes to, potential social distancing, restaurants not being open. They're going to need to have more subsidies to be able to lower the rents to attract people to use those retail spaces. So there's going to be a lot of impact from the economy that I think the historic tax credit can help. And certainly California can benefit from that and outpace your neighbors. I'm sure most of you think you're already outpace your neighbors, but outpace your neighbors by attracting investment into the state of California through an expanded federal program and a very strong state program. And that is, I think, what I have to say.
Okay, thanks, Albert. Tony, you're up.
Thank you, Cindy. Great job, Albert. It's great to be here. I see 182 participants from around the country, and this is fantastic. I'm Tony Gonzalez. I'm a lobbyist in Sacramento and have worked with Cindy for maybe almost a decade now. I think when we first talked about the possibility of enacting a historic tax credit in California, and about 10 years ago, we were in the middle of a very brutal recession. The environment was just not there. The political environment was not there. The will was not there to enact anything like this at that time. So we, had to wait it out until 2014. I won't go through the long story. Cindy covered a lot of this ground, but what really made it possible for us in the end to get this done was the strong support, having the strong support of then Assembly Speaker Tony Atkins, who is now, and last year was, the Senate pro tem, basically the Senate majority leader. I think a first in California history that the same person who was once an Assembly Speaker went on to become Senate pro tem. So having her truly undying support, weathering it through thick and thin while she had a lot of other things to deal with was critical. And I'm glad to see the question being brought up on screen. Do you know or are familiar with your state legislator? We'll see right now, I think it's 62 to 38 yes to no. That's actually pretty impressive. I would have expected maybe more like 38 to 62. And that's really relevant to one of my core points that I'd like to make to everyone here is that it really was through not just getting the support of Tony Atkins with the help of Save Our Heritage organization in San Diego, Bruce Coons, who did a great job of helping us along with Tony Atkins back then and more recently now, but folks in San Francisco, Sacramento, Pasadena, LA, you name it, contacting your state legislator, as corny as it sounds, really makes the difference in getting these things done and getting this done. We only got it done last year after fits and starts, and I think a really good overview was provided both by Cindy and Albert as to what the elements of the California legislation are. I won't cover all that ground again, but I'll just mention a couple of highlights that of this legislation that needed to be included in the legislation that really reflects the political reality that we have in California, a state that up until a few months ago was, on fire economically and certainly was last year. But we did face a couple of demands that were just not movable. One of them was a sunset. All these new tax credits, maybe with the exception of the income tax credit, we just need to be enacted with a sunset clause. We enact tax credits with a majority vote, but unless they're sunsetted, to repeal that tax credit it would take a 2/3 vote, pursuant to how Prop 13 and Prop 26 have been interpreted over the years. So almost without exception, and there are one or two big exceptions, all of these new economic development tax credits are sunsetted, almost without exception that I can't think of. Also, they're allocated, or at least they're budgeted for in some way. So this is an allocated tax credit, meaning that there is a cap on the number of dollars that can be issued in the form of tax credits by the state of California. Again, that's a political reality that, again, maybe with the exception of the earned income tax credit, is just how it's going to be, because these things need to be budgeted for, even if there's universal acknowledgement that this tax credit more than pays for itself. In terms of how these things get scored, there needs to be a dollar amount, and then we stick to that dollar amount. That dollar amount can change over time, and that's important to us, and I'll get into that in just a minute. But it is on the books right now, $50 million annually over a 5-year period of time. But there does need to be affirmative language in the Budget Act, notwithstanding the statute, that essentially funds the tax credit, or at least we can think of it that way. And so far in this budget bill that the legislature just approved yesterday, but it's very conditional. It's just a placeholder approval to buy themselves 12 more days to work it out with Governor Newsom so that we can have a budget in place at the beginning of the new fiscal year, July 1st. There is no money, nothing budgeted for the tax credit, for the historic tax credit. That said, oh, and I think everyone knows this. Of course, we're facing significant general fund losses in California. Governor Newsom has projected a general fund hit of $54.3 billion. There are different elements of how we got to that sum. Some of that deficit hole will be covered or addressed through borrowing or taking from the rainy day fund. Some deep cuts in social, education, and other services, health services. Some backdoor tax increases in the form of closing various credits and deductions, at least temporarily. And I think an assumption about how much we might be able to get from the federal government in the form of, for lack of a better term, relief for the states and local governments. Yeah, that really is just an unanswerable question right now. But I'm confident. Whether it's in August or September, I think the pressure on Congress and on the White House to provide some dollars, maybe not the $3 trillion that the House Democrats passed, maybe about a month ago. That's probably not going to happen, but it's a number to start from and back down from that I think we shall see will provide relief to the states, including red states as well as California. And if that's the case, we will revisit in at whatever point in time we're at in our fiscal year, what we can budget for in terms of restoring funding for certain K-12 programs, adult daycare services, as well as economic stimulus measures like the historic tax credit. So a lot of balls are juggling at the same time, but given the hole that we're looking at, this is one that did not have the political constituency yet to get into the budget agreement. But what I would say, going back to your legislator, and going back to Senator Atkins, and going back to the governor's office, is that if we have something to work with on the macroeconomic level in California, what I would really like to see is either if there are prospective projects out there in San Diego all the way up to Eureka that are candidates for deployment of the tax credit, get that information to Cindy and contact your state legislator, both in the Assembly and in the Senate, And if you're in San Diego, well, there are several Assembly Democrats in the area, but Senator Atkins, she definitely would need to know. If you're in the Central Valley, well, there's a lot of different legislators to let them know. But if they hear the drumbeat, you know what, there's a project ready to go in Stockton or in Riverside or wherever, contact your state legislator, contact Cindy. You know, we need to convey that to especially Senator Atkins, that, you know, we have, I'll just make up a number, 18 projects that are maybe not shovel ready, but ready to go, or there is real interest in pursuing these projects. You know, downtown revitalization, especially if there's a housing element in, or housing aspect of that adaptive reuse, then you know, we need to know that, and Senator Atkins needs to know that, because I think with the housing legislation, and again, nothing exists in a vacuum. We've, you know, when Governor Newsom took office, you know, what was the crisis? Wildfire, and then pretty much at the same time, the PG&E bankruptcy. Now it's COVID. It's also now criminal justice reform. There's always something that's a front burner issue, and he's had, you know, unlike Governor Brown, and I think also Governor Newsom, well, not Schwarzenegger, in a different way. You know, they didn't really have to deal with natural disasters, except for Governor Brown at the very end. But Governor Newsom has these crises on his hand, natural and human disasters. And so getting getting the governor's office attention on this has been difficult, but I will say we got the bill through. And I want to give a plug to the state treasurer, Fiona Ma, and her staff, as well as the for lack of a better term, the technical staff at the Office of Historic Preservation. They could not take a position on the bill until the end, but gave us great technical brick and mortar feedback as far as, well, if you're going to do this, this is how it could work. And so while the building blocks of putting the application process and getting the program, quote unquote, funded hasn't happened yet, that can happen pretty quickly, but other shoes need to fall to make that happen. And the only thing I just want to just restate one more time is, you know, stay in touch with your legislator. That's just critically important. You don't need to know them that well personally, and things are different now because of COVID-19. You can't really get to know them personally in person anytime soon, but their staff, both in the Capitol and the district office, do listen to their constituents, and, you know, questions brought to their attention or issues brought to their attention really do make a difference in the end. And but I think letting Cindy know whether there's a project in Stockton, Eureka, El Centro is a possibility, but only if the, you know, tax credit could be funded, authorized, deployed, would make all the difference in the world. And with that, those are my remarks, and I don't know if we're ready for questions, but I'm ready.
Yeah, Tony, I just want to underscore the importance and the impact of identifying those projects and contacting your legislator. When we went through this campaign to get the support of the legislature, and when we went before the various committee hearings, this was on the forefront, was to identify projects in each of those legislators' districts and to let them know that there are projects within their district, significant projects that benefited from the federal historic tax credit. So I cannot underemphasize the importance of that point you made.
And certainly a game plan has been used in many of the other states. And you know, the other thing is to make sure that as you tell those stories, you can combine them with not just the economic stories, but the place stories, people stories, the building stories. It does help. I think Tony's point is, you know, right on. You know, legislatures, you might not think of, but they are made up of people, and the people do, you know, listen to those stories, and it's so effective to be able to show them in their district how something happens. Because once you find out, once a credit gets passed, you'll realize that, you know, a large portion of the legislature, once it sees it work, often will vote the way of the credit, because it's a way for them to get money into their local municipality, support that municipality, and really do it effectively. So what we've seen in other states is that, telling those stories, as Cindy pointed out, is one of the more important components of getting folks to buy into these programs.
Mhm.
Great, is John on there? So we have a lot of questions. This is Chris. I can start with a question here for the panelist from Naomi. If a project is submitted for federal tax credits in October 2020, before the state tax credit is available, can the project be submitted for the state tax credit if it is available in 2021?
Oh my goodness. There is, Tony, I don't know if you recall, there is a start date in the bill.
Yeah, basically where we are right now is because it's not funded. There's no authorization, but and of course we're working on that, but the authorization begins, I believe, January 1, 21, and ends, I'll have to double check, I think it's December 31, 26. But might have to double check the legislation there.
Yeah, it's January 126.
That's right. Now, I should mention very briefly, not to go too deep into a lesson on how legislation works, but I'll say that at the point in time where we budget for the tax credit is also a point in time where the statutory construction around the tax credit can be modified through what we call budget trailer bill language. So, for example, if for whatever reason we do not fund the tax credit at all this year, but that we're in a good place to that is this fiscal year starting July 1st, but that as we go into the next budget cycle beginning July 1, 2021, that is for that fiscal year, if we do fund the historic tax credit, what I would work on, and I hope to be successful in, is revising the terms, including one, extending the sunset date so that we get a fresh 5 years from the start of the program and not 4 years left. Two, seeing if we can poke around on the $50 million cap itself. I mean, if I had, just for the sake of argument, 17 projects in hand, ready to go, documented with, some degree of confidence, but that, that those 17 projects would oversubscribe the $50 million cap, then I would see if I could, get that pushed up to 60, 75, whatever that appropriate number would be. That would be directly tied to the estimated demand for those tax credits of those 17 projects. And any other little internal provisions relating to the original bill enacted in SB 451. So, and we do this all the time. We constantly are, I would say in general, most laws that we passed, including budget trailer bills as separate bills, are really modifications of existing laws. I mean, we do pass a few new laws here and there like SB 451, but the vast majority of the work that we do is tinkering with existing statutes. And I would imagine that would be the case here too.
Yeah.
Just to add to that real quick, that was our experience in Massachusetts. Our initial bill was only $10 million, a program cap, and within 3 years it was $50 million. So it was really the idea of getting, for lack of, it's like having a starter home. It's this starter bill, right? Get people to whet their appetite a little bit about it, see that it can really work, and then you can work on it from year to year. And as Tony has pointed out, you have to work on these bills from year to year because there's always going to be a legislative challenge every year relative to trying to balance a budget or figure out the finances of a state.
Yeah, but I think that back to the question here, if the question was regarding the start date of the project with respect to the submittal for tax credits, just wanted to point out that the rules have yet to be determined. So the OHP and CTAC, the Treasury Tax Allocation Committee, still need to work out the rules about and develop the application for the tax credit program.
I have a question for everybody here. In terms of qualification, I think Cindy mentions that anything listed on the state register would qualify, but I don't know if you fully clarified the national register, and I just want you to, maybe the panel to maybe clarify. This also includes national register listed properties and contributors to national register listed districts. Is that right?
Yes, and actually this was a question that I asked very early on because the legislation is specific. It says California register, and if a project is listed on the national register in California, it is automatically listed on the California register.
Mm-hmm.
So the answer is yes.
There was another question about census. I think there was a 5% bonus for properties within a specific designated census area, and somebody wanted clarification on what you mean by that.
Tony? The census tracts, where did Tony go?
Oh, he was muted.
Oh.
I'm sorry. You know, let's skip to another question. I'll dig that up and I'll answer in just a minute. I could go back and read the legislation.
Yeah, the census tracts are defined and John, why don't you go to the next question? We'll get back to that.
I have some questions too. There's some questions about the amount. Is it minimum of 5,000 and what is the maximum? And somebody said that they believed it's $20,000 maximum. Could we maybe just get a clarification on the
Sure,
numbers?
I'm sorry. I think that was my mistake. It is, I believe it is 25,000, but that's only for residential.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And so another one related to funding is has the current $50 million cap been allocated by the state, or does it still need to be approved?
Still needs to be approved.
Yeah.
Tony?
Oh, sorry. Let me remind.
He's multitasking.
The budget agreement does not yet have an allocation budgeted for the tax credit. So the statute, the construct exists, but it's not yet funded. We were in a great place until the pandemic. The pandemic hit, cuts, and so at this point, we're, you know, the budget is, the tax credit is not yet funded. Probably won't happen in the next 10, 12 days because they're looking at where they can save money, and the thinking is, gee, we're not going to, quote, spend $50 million. But if there is fiscal relief down the road from the federal government in the form of the state and local government stimulus bill, which includes a lot of other elements, then it's conceivable we could see revenue that could be, quote, allocated for the tax credit.
There was a question, while Tony is looking up maybe the census question, I'll move on to one about the actual application for, so the sort of timeline for things. So Diane is asking if a property, does the property have to be designated before the application for the tax credit, or can you do a simultaneous application where you're designating the property and also applying for the tax credit?
Yeah, this isn't identified in the legislation. I think this might fall under the rules, but what the legislation does say is that the property must be listed on the California register. So whether that is something that would become effective or must be effective when the application is submitted or at some point in the process is something that's not called out in the bill that might fall under the regulations.
Okay.
Back on the designated census tract, the term designated census tract has a defined meaning in the taxation code. It's an indicia of economic health, and I had to go back to the statute to determine what that means. I'll just read it. It's pretty brief. Designated census tract means a census tract within the state that is determined by the Department of Finance to have a civilian unemployment rate that is within the top 25% of all census tracts within the state, and has a poverty rate within the top 25% of all census tracts within the state. Meaning that a census tract that is, for lack of a better term, severely economically distressed would be a census tract that would trigger the bonus 5%, I believe.
Yeah,
Great,
Chris,
thanks. You want me to take the next one, John?
Yes, please do.
Okay, I had a question here. Is the application process for the state tax credit the same or similar to the process for the federal?
Again, the application hasn't been developed yet. The rules and the regulations are still pending. But the understanding at the time that we went through this was that the application for the National Register and the the national federal tax credits and the state tax credits could be concurrent. So I would assume, based on that, there would be parallel, that there would be crossover between them within the OHP. Now, again, it's subject to development, subject to approval. It hasn't gone through that process yet. But I think it is different in that the applications also have to go through the tax credit allocation committee. So there's really two reviews that must occur. So there is some definite crossover, and that was intentional. But it has that additional layer of review by the tax credit allocation committee.
That's right. The intent was to align and streamline the application with the federal tax credit as much as possible. And there will be some additional hurdles at the state level. Going through the tax credit allocation committee was really a requirement to make sure that there's a second pair of eyes to assess the projected economic impact, to make sure that it's a real economic impact. And because this is an allocated tax credit, there was a desire, I think a rational desire, to make sure that if an applicant is projecting a certain economic impact, that it's that it's real, or at least is defensible in front of another pair of eyes at the treasurer's office, who which has the expertise to make these kinds of evaluations.
And generally, because it is a capped program, there has to be some way to separate some of these projects out as well. And you find that in most capped programs, that there's a second step. You have, pretty much traditionally follow the part 1, part 2, and part 3 layout of the federal program, but you often have these additional criteria as they're spelled out in the legislation about the financial components of a project.
All right, I'll take the next one. See, John is still reading. This is an interesting question from Jeffrey, saying that, or noting that there are likely to be significant increases in vacancies in Main Street retail districts. Would you see this as the time to make a big push for preservation tax credits in terms of economic development and promoting the recovery?
I don't think there's any question. This tax credit from the beginning was promoted as an economic stimulus. And, I think the point is really underscored now with what we may be facing in terms of the economic impact. And so, I think it's very important for us as as our role in advocating for this is to know what's out there, the types of projects that may be in the pipeline, identify, the developers, the projects, the communities, work with the legislators to present this information to show that the demand is great. And in fact, we believe and have believed from the beginning that the demand would outstrip the availability of the tax credits. And I don't see that that's going to change.
And it is fairly simple math if you really think about it. It costs the developer X to develop the building. If he takes a bank loan out for Y, the less that bank loan is, the better he can, the lower the rents can be, the more effective he can be at, you know, creating an opportunity for somebody to rent that space. Where if he's, you know, taking out a larger bank loan because there is no state credit, it's just going to make it harder to rent the space. It's pretty simple math, actually.
So there are some questions about the sort of the benefits of the tax credit, the presumed benefits for county-owned historic structures. But you know, and maybe the three of you can clarify on this. But you know, this is a tax credit that can it be transferred or sold to other entities? So certain entities like nonprofits could benefit from it. Or is it one of those tax credits that really stays with the person that is, you know, the owner and the project, the main project lead or the owner?
It mirrors the New York credit, which is also a credit that's like this. It can't be bifurcated, so it can't be sold on the open market. It has to be allocated into a partner in a partnership, which is another reason that it will increase the amount of federal credit used, because it kind of piggybacks in the same format that federal credit does. So it's important to note that, you know, it makes the federal credit process, you're gonna have to spend the dollars to do both, legal dollars and CPA dollars. So it just makes it more efficient from that perspective.
Okay, thank you. And then there were, and I'm going to cover some of the early questions that are asked. And if these were already covered, I was sort of going through these and I may not have heard a question answered. So just shake your head no if it's already answered. But there were two questions. One that came in to clarify the 10 million set aside and whether or not it's renewed annually. Maybe Cindy can answer that.
I mean, it's in the bill.
Yeah.
You know, that this is set aside. So of the 50 million, the pot, 40 million is available for larger commercial projects. 8 million is set aside for smaller commercial projects with value of less than $1 million in QREs. And then 2 million is set aside for the residential. Any amount of the tax credit that, or the allocation that is not used, gets rolled over to the next year. So if, in theory, hypothetically, if you have 50 million total that's available and only 30 million is available or used, that excess gets rolled over to next year. Correct, Tony? So the next year, the funds that are available is 20 million, or pardon me, 70 million?
Yeah, that is correct. But there is one unanswered question in this regard in the legislation. That is, well, let's just take your example. If 30 of the 50 were allocated for large projects, and of the 10 million that's set aside for smaller projects isn't used at all, what, you know, and that rolls over to the next year, does that 10 million roll into the bucket for small projects, or does it roll into the big bucket altogether? We never really addressed that. That would be one of those trailer bill fixes that we would look at depending on what kind of demand that we see. If we see tons of projects and they're all for large projects, you know, or the demand is for large projects. And if we see that and we don't really see much of a demand for small projects, just to put it that way, then we probably would need to tweak that statutory language to make sure that the full 50 or the full whatever that dollar amount would be can be allocated to those projects for which there is real demand right now or at that time.
That's great. We were going to take some more questions, but we've already run out of time. Can you believe it? An hour has gone by already. So I wanted to thank everybody for participating, Albert, Tony, and Cindy especially. I wanted to remind everyone listening that your membership does support these free programs from CPF, so I would encourage everyone to go to our website and check that out. We also have a free program coming up on Thursday night that you won't want to miss, and it has Alan Hess and special guests Chris Nichols, William Kopelk, and Mark Davis of Palm Springs Modernism Week, talking about what is modernism and how do we save it. And that starts at 5:30 on Thursday. That's also free. So be sure you join us again, and we want to thank everyone for coming today.
Thank you.
You want to wrap
Okay.
it up, John?
Okay, I just have one more thing to say. I left a chat message in the chat box, so let us know how we did today and leave some feedback. And also remind everybody, as Chris did, that we do have a modernism series coming up. We're really looking forward to seeing you there. You can sign up for the whole series of 7 online by visiting our website at californiapreservation.org. And thank you to our panelists today. What I'll do is I'll close out the box to end the meeting, but if you need to leave feedback about today, you can just go to californiapreservation.org/e, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. So thank you all today and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks.